Welcome to Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. Sean Deneen. I'm doing a solo here today. Today, we examine one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern American history, President Harry S. Truman's dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War. This was not simply a quarrel between a plain-spoken president and a proud general. It was at the same time a constitutional test, a military crisis, a Cold War turning point, and a debate over one of the most difficult questions in American strategy. When a war cannot safely be won in the old-fashioned sense, what then does victory mean? On April 11th, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command in the Far East and replaced him with Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. President Truman's official statement said that MacArthur was unable to give wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and the United Nations. Truman also emphasized that military commanders must obey civilian policy in a constitutional democracy. That decision shocked the nation. MacArthur was not just another officer. He was a five-star general, a hero of the Pacific War, the man associated with the return to the Philippines, and later the occupation and reconstruction of Japan. See our MacArthur podcast to talk about that. And then the bold Incheon landing in Korea. To many Americans, firing MacArthur looked like an insult to victory itself. But to Truman, the issue was not MacArthur's past service. Truman openly acknowledged MacArthur's historical importance. The question was whether a military commander could publicly challenge national policy during a war, especially a war that risked expanding into direct conflict with Communist China and perhaps the Soviet Union in the Third World War. So today, let us examine the firing of MacArthur not as a simple story of hero versus politician, but as a serious case study in civil-military relations, the idea of limited war, public opinion, and the danger of confusing military brilliance with constitutional authority. To understand the firing, we must begin with the Korean War itself. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea across the 38th parallel. The Eisenhower Presidential Library summarizes the invasion as a coordinated attack by the North Korean People's Army aimed at conquering South Korea and unifying the peninsula under the communist regime in the north. President Truman committed American forces to the United Nations defense of South Korea and appointed General MacArthur to command the United Nations Command. At first, the war went badly for the United States and its 16 allies. North Korean forces pushed South Korean and United Nations forces into the Pusan perimeter, a desperate defensive zone in the southeastern corner of Korea. Then, in September 1950, MacArthur launched the amphibious landing at Incheon, a daring operation that struck behind North Korean lines and transformed the war. The North Korean advance collapsed, and United Nations forces moved northward. At that point, the war's purpose changed. The initial goal had been to repel aggression and defend South Korea. After Incheon, however, United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel and moved toward the Yellow River, the border with Communist China. This raised an enormous strategic risk. China had warned against a hostile army approaching its frontier, and in late 1950, Chinese forces, disguised as volunteers, entered the war in large numbers. This changed everything. What had looked like a possible victory over North Korea became a larger and far more dangerous war against Chinese forces. The United Nations armies were driven back. Seoul changed hands again. The war became brutal, costly, and increasingly stalemated. Here we begin to see the divide between Truman and MacArthur. For Truman, Korea was part of a broader Cold War strategy. The United States wanted to resist communist expansion, but not at the price of triggering World War III. Truman's approach was containment: defend South Korea, preserve the United Nations coalition, avoid reckless escalation, and prevent a regional conflict from becoming a global catastrophe. MacArthur saw the situation differently. He believed that the United States should use greater force against China and not accept a stalemate. He opposed restrictions that prevented attacks across the Chinese border and argued that there was no substitute for victory, a phrase that became closely associated with his position. In a March 1951 letter, later disclosed in Congress, MacArthur argued that Asia was where communism had chosen to make its decisive play and that victory there was essential. This was not a small disagreement. It was a disagreement over the very nature of the war. Was Korea a limited war, fought to defend South Korea and avoid global escalation? Or was it a broader war against Chinese communism that had to be expanded until decisive victory was achieved? MacArthur's view had emotional power. Americans were accustomed to thinking of war in terms of absolute victory and surrender. The Second World War had ended only 6 years earlier. The United States had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan through a policy of unconditional surrender. Against that memory, the idea of fighting a war at all without pursuing total victory felt unnatural, even dishonorable to many. But the atomic age changed the meaning of war. Truman understood that fighting China could draw in the Soviet Union. They were still allies in this period. The United States had to consider not only the battlefield in Korea, but also Europe, nuclear weapons, alliance policies, and the possibility of a much larger war. In that context, restraint was not weakness, it was a strategy. Yet strategy alone did not cause MacArthur's dismissal. The deeper issue was authority. The American Constitution makes the president the civilian commander-in-chief. Military leaders advise. They command forces. They execute policy. But they do not decide national policy on their own. Truman's problem with MacArthur was that the general did not merely disagree privately. He made public statements and allowed his views to become part of a public campaign against administration policy. In December 1950, after earlier controversies, the Truman administration required all military and diplomatic officials to clear public statements on foreign and military policy through the appropriate departments. The official materials released with Truman's dismissal included this December directive, as well as later communications reminding MacArthur that his statements had to be coordinated. Then came the incident that pushed the conflict to its breaking point. Representative Joseph Martin, the Republican minority leader in the House, disclosed a letter from MacArthur. In it, MacArthur supported a more aggressive position and repeated the idea that there was no substitute for victory. The State Department's historical record notes that after this letter was disclosed, Truman consulted with his diplomatic and military advisors on whether to dismiss MacArthur. Office of the Presidential Historian has information on that. The letter mattered because it placed MacArthur in opposition to the president's policy before Congress and the public. It made the issue impossible to ignore. If Truman allowed MacArthur to remain in command after publicly challenging policy, it could appear that the president no longer controlled the war. That is the crucial point. Truman was not firing MacArthur because MacArthur lacked talent. He was firing him because talent does not outrank constitutional authority. On April 9, 1951, General Omar Bradley reported the judgment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that on military grounds MacArthur should be replaced. The State Department's historical record indicates that this judgment was unanimously supported by leading advisors, including Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, and George Marshall. General Ridgway would take over MacArthur's commands. So Truman's decision was not made in isolation. It followed consultation with senior civilian and military officials. Still, Truman knew the political cost would be severe, and it was. When MacArthur returned to the United States, he was greeted not as a disgraced subordinate, but as a national hero. On April 19, 1951, he addressed a joint meeting of Congress. The House Historical Record notes that MacArthur argued for a tougher course against Communist China, and that hundreds of thousands of people turned out in Washington to cheer him. The speech became famous for its closing line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." It was theatrical, dignified, and deeply effective. MacArthur presented himself as a soldier who had done his duty as he understood it. The Library of Congress notes that much of the nation listened by radio and that many in the packed chamber were visibly moved. For Truman, however, the issue remained larger than MacArthur's personal dignity. The president had to defend the principle that elected civilian authority sets policy. If generals could appeal over the president's head to Congress, newspapers, and public opinion while still commanding forces in the field, the chain of command would be dangerously weakened. That is why the Macarthur firing remains one of the classic examples of civilian-military tension in American history. We should also be fair to MacArthur. MacArthur was not simply reckless or foolish. He had a coherent worldview. He believed communism had to be confronted decisively. He believed restrictions on his command gave the enemy an advantage. He believed that fighting a war without the will to win was morally and militarily unsound. Many Americans agreed with him. There is a serious argument that limited war is frustrating, costly, and politically corrosive. Soldiers are asked to risk their lives without being allowed to use all possible means. Commanders are told to fight, but not too much, to advance, but not too far, to punish the enemy, but not provoke the enemy's patrons. From the perspective of a battlefield commander, these restrictions can appear irrational, but from the perspective of national policy, restrictions may be essential. The Korean War was not fought in a vacuum. It occurred in a world divided by nuclear weapons, alliance systems, and fears of a Soviet move in Europe. Truman's administration did not want to sacrifice Berlin, NATO, or the possibility of general peace for the sake of expanding the war in Korea. That is the harsh reality of limited war. The battlefield is not always the center of the strategic universe. So was Truman right to fire MacArthur? In constitutional terms, absolutely yes. As we said, a democratic republic cannot allow military commanders to decide war policy independently of civilian authority. The president may be wrong, Congress may object, the public may protest, but the military chain of command cannot become a rival source of national policy. In strategic terms, Truman also had a strong case. Expanding the war into China could have led to a wider Asian war or even a global war. Truman's priority was to prevent escalation while preserving South Korea. That goal was limited, but it was not meaningless. South Korea survived. In political terms, however, Truman paid a high price. MacArthur's popularity made the firing appear to many as an attack on a national hero. Truman's reputation suffered in the short term. MacArthur's farewell speech gave the general the emotional advantage. Truman looked small to some Americans, even if his constitutional argument was strong. But history often treats the event differently from the public of 1951. The firing of MacArthur has become a reminder that civilian control is not merely a peacetime slogan. It matters most when the general is famous, the president is unpopular, the war is frustrating, and the public wants clarity. It is easy to defend civilian control when the officer is obscure. It is much harder when the officer is Douglas MacArthur. That is why Truman's action was so consequential. He did not deny MacArthur's greatness. In fact, Truman's official statement said MacArthur's place in history was fully established. But Truman insisted that even a great commander must remain subordinate to lawful civilian authority. That is a principle older than the Korean War. George Washington embodied it when he resigned his commission after the American Revolution. Abraham Lincoln struggled with it during the Civil War as he replaced generals who would not or could not carry out policy. The principle is simple but profound. In the United States, the military serves the republic. It does not govern it. MacArthur's dismissal also reveals the complexity of victory. MacArthur wanted victory over communism in Asia. Truman wanted to prevent defeat in Korea without causing disaster elsewhere. Each man used a different map. MacArthur's map centered on the battlefield. Truman's map included Korea, China, the Soviet Union, Europe, the United Nations, nuclear weapons, public opinion, and constitutional order. A commander asks, "How do I defeat the enemy in front of me?" A president must also ask, what happens after that? Who enters the war? What does this do to alliances? What does this do to the Constitution? What does this do to the world? That is not an argument against generals. It is an argument for understanding the difference between military command and political leadership. The firing of MacArthur was in many ways a tragedy of incompatible virtues. MacArthur possessed courage, imagination, and an almost theatrical belief in decisive action. Truman possessed caution, constitutional seriousness, and a willingness to absorb public anger for what he believed was the survival of democratic command. MacArthur's strength was his refusal to accept a stalemate. The world probably would have been better off without 60-plus years of North Korea. Truman's strength was his refusal to let one general redefine national policy. The Korean War did not end quickly. It settled into an armistice, not a victory. The peninsula remained and remains divided. Yet South Korea endured, and over time it became one of the most success stories of the post-World War and is today a first-world economy and a fully functioning democracy. That outcome does not make the Korean War simple. It does not erase the suffering, but it does remind us that limited objectives can still matter. MacArthur firing asks us to consider a difficult lesson. Sometimes the most important victory is not the dramatic battlefield triumph. Sometimes it is the preservation of constitutional order, even under pressure. And that may be, my friends, why this episode still matters. It is not just about Truman. It is not just about MacArthur. It is about whether a democracy can fight a dangerous war without being captive, even to its most celebrated warrior. For Things You Don't Know, I'm Dr. Sean Deneen. Come back and see us again soon, folks. Leave a like and comments. Thank you for listening.